My wife's mom used to say that she had champagne tastes in a beer pocketbook, and I can relate to that. I like buying nice things, but I don't necessarily like spending more money. If you also like a little luxury, then Quince is a good solution for luxury essentials at affordable prices. Quince offers a range of high quality items at prices within reach, like 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters from $50. I'm hearing good things about them from my friends, so mine is on order. So I'll tell you about that when it comes. The best part, all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. By partnering directly with factories, Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to us. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. And I love that. Give yourself the luxury you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/traveler for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
This episode is brought to you by Companion. Iris and Josh seem like the perfect match, but when a weekend getaway turns into a nightmare, Iris realizes that things aren't as perfect as they appear. From the creators of Barbarian and the studio that brought you The Notebook comes a twisted tale of modern romance and the sweet satisfaction of revenge. Companion, now playing only in theaters. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
Amateur Traveler, episode 931. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about corals and colonization and crocodiles, hiking and microlets and umalulek, as we go to the small nation of Timor-Leste. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Timor-Leste. I'd like to welcome to the show Jonty Crane from exploringtimor.com, who's come to talk to us about Timor-Leste. Jonty, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And this is one you're going to have to put on a map for us, because I'm willing to bet that this is one that maybe half the people in the audience don't know where we're talking about.
I thought it was interesting because I looked on your podcast. You've got a beautiful website with a Google map, which has all the countries in the world where you've done podcasts from. And I'm looking around, and you've done like 3 in Papua New Guinea, and there's all these random Pacific islands there's podcasts on, but there is nothing from Timor-Leste. So I'm glad to be able to put a pin on your map. And yeah, so Timor-Leste is about an hour north of the top of Australia at the end of the Indonesian archipelago. Timor-Leste is the eastern half of the island of Timor, and the western half is part of Indonesia. And then you've got Alor, which is very close, and then kind of Flores and Bali and all the various kind of islands of Indonesia off to the west there. So it is part of Southeast Asia, although often it has a bit of an affinity, particularly in like UN forums and things, with the Pacific, because it is a small country, or relative, it's 1.3 million people. So that's big by Pacific standards, but obviously small by Southeast Asian standards. And they're in the process actually of trying to join ASEAN at the moment to be a member of the Southeast Asia community. But they are probably one of the smallest and the poorest by some margin country in Southeast Asia, and they're also the least visited. I think it's one of the 20 least visited countries in the world. The last stats for 2019 pre-COVID, there was probably about 25,000 tourists who came to Timor. Last year, Bali had 23 million visitors. So it's at the opposite end. Over-tourism is a thing, under-tourism is a thing. So this is very much an under-tourism adventure destination.
Excellent. And what is your connection with Timor-Leste? Why are we talking about it here today?
So I live here, so hopefully I can give quite a detailed overview of the country. So I came out here in February 2024 to volunteer. So I'm from New Zealand, and there's a NGO called Volunteer Service Abroad. The equivalent in Australia is AVI. It's a little bit like the Peace Corps in America. There's also Quaker, and the Japanese and Korean have got kind of equivalent things. It's a fantastic NGO. They basically connect up people who want to volunteer from New Zealand with countries in the Pacific and Timor-Leste where there is a need, with partner organisations. And so I've been out here since February volunteering with a health NGO and also a bit with the the Ministry of Tourism. So I've kind of kept myself busy exploring the country, and then I've created this kind of exploringtimor.com website. I've written 4 books about Timor, which are available on Amazon. So Exploring Timor-Leste, there's a guidebook, there's a hiking book, and there's 2 photography books. And then also, if you look on YouTube or TikTok, I've got channels on there as well. So I'm trying to do my bit to promote this country, because it is a poor country. Like, it's a least developed country. So the UN classifications, sort of 200 countries in the world, about 35 of those are least developed. So the GDP per capita here is similar to kind of Ethiopia and Nepal, but it's a much smaller country. So, those countries, although they're poor, they do have some money in Kathmandu and Addis Ababa. Here is, the other end of the scale.
Excellent. And why should someone go to Timor-Leste?
Because nobody else goes, if that's your thing. It was quite a shock when I went to Australia and there was tourists, whereas going around Timor, there's almost no tourists, so that's kind of a bonus. And it has world-class snorkeling, world-class diving, world-class hiking. It's got quite an interesting culture and history. So it was a Portuguese colony for about 450 years. Then the Japanese occupied it in World War II. And then when the Portuguese left, the Indonesians invaded in 1975, and it was a very brutal kind of occupation. And so it's some quite harrowing stories and history from that era. And then it's a country with a sort of a happy ending, which is quite unusual these days. In 1999, there was a referendum and Indonesian forces left. And then in 2002, it joined the United Nations as one of the newest countries in the world. It's nice to see one of these few situations where they've actually fought against the oppressors, they've left, and they've gained independence, and they're very proud about being their own country.
Excellent. And what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
So I normally talk about a week, don't you? So I will focus a little bit on Dili, which is the capital, which is the only city really in the country. And that's the only way really to get in and out is going through Dili. So it's worth spending a couple of days here. And then Atiu Island, which is only an hour and a half away by ferry from Dili. And if I use the word tourist hub, that's overselling it, but it's very accessible. And the snorkeling and the diving there really is phenomenal. And there's also quite interesting hiking. And then I'll give you a few different options for basically if you go out of Dili and kind of go east or west or south, you can go to historic sites or beach sites or into the mountains. So you've got like a range of things available for you.
Well, we're starting in Dili. What are we going to do and see in Dili?
So Dili is a city of about 300,000 people in a country of 1.3 million. The second biggest city in Timor-Leste has a population of 20,000. So it is like a lot of capitals are. It is quite different to the rest of the country. There is traffic here. There are lots of people. There's noise everywhere in Timor, but it's not a Ho Chi Minh, it's not a Bangkok, but it's a reasonably bustling little city on the waterfront. So it has quite a beautiful setting. We were just talking before, Chris, about I live in Wellington, New Zealand, and actually Dili reminds me of a sort of tropical version of Wellington. You've got a beautiful ocean and you're looking out towards Atiu Island. There is actually quite good snorkeling in Dili, particularly out towards kind of Cristo Rey, which I'll talk about in a bit. In that kind of area, there's some quite good snorkeling. Then you've got the city kind of on the flat, and then you've got all these hills that go up behind the city, and they reach up to about 500 meters above sea level. So there is quite a decent, nice topography. And as a hiker, I've done a lot of day hikes up into the hills around Dili and get beautiful views, and it's a really good way to explore the city.
Are there a hike or two that you would recommend if we're in Dili?
Yes. Yeah, which one to pick? I think one of the best ways actually is there is a Facebook group called Dili Saturday Walkers. And that's been running for about 10 years. It's like the United Nations when you go along. There are people, there's Timorese, there's what I refer to as Malay. Timorese call foreigners Malay. And I think the word originates from Malaysian traders 400 or 500 years ago. It doesn't mean they think you're Malaysian, but basically a foreigner is a Malay. So if I use that word, that's the context. So they meet every Saturday morning at 7 a.m. and they go and do a different walk around Dili. And so if you happen to be here at the weekend, that's a really good way of exploring the city, meeting some interesting people. Because one of the things about Timor is, as I say, there's very few tourists, which is good as a tourist, but it also means the infrastructure around tourism is very minimal. And so there are hiking trails throughout the country. There is no signage. There is no maps. There is you will end up walking through people's houses. They've got their chickens. They might have some cows, some water buffalo. It's very much an authentic experience. But if you're not used to that it helps to do it in the company of other people. Local
Okay.
tour operators as well could help you with some walks. And I'll mention one easy walk that you can do without needing a group or a tour guide or anything like that is in Tassie Tolu. So Dili runs along the waterfront. To the west of the city centre is an area called Tassie Tolu. So Tassie in the local language Teton means sea and Tolu means three. So it's three seas and basically it's three lakes. But in the wet season, there's two lakes because they merge. And particularly if you go there in the morning and if you want to do hiking, you need to start early. Like Timor is a hot country, it's tropical, it's humid. It's 9 degrees off the equator, so you want to be starting around sunrise, sort of 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. There's a beautiful, easy, flat 1 hour walk, and you shouldn't be able to get lost because you just keep the lake to your left and you just walk around the lake. And important bird sites. So for any birders out there, you like to see cormorants, you like to see herons, and a whole bunch of different bird life. Quite a lot of it's migratory, so it depends on the time of year. If you're into photography, often if you go early, they can be very still, and so you can get beautiful reflections. And it also, this will not be in most tourist guidebooks, but it will take you through, it'll give you a bit of a flavour for what it's like as a Timorese living. You'll see the houses, you see the shops. It's pretty basic. A lot of those who live there have come from the districts and have been sort of squatting illegally on the land. It's completely safe. Timor is a very safe place to visit, but you'll get that kind of local flavour and it's easy and you can't get lost and it's about an hour's walk and it's very pleasant. And there's public transport out to there on one of the microlets, which is the kind of local buses, the number 10. So that's your kind of easy walk for some exercise. If you're interested in the history of Timor-Leste, there's three kind of important sites within Dili. Actually, one thing to know about Dili, the Portuguese were here for 450 years. It was never a priority for the Portuguese Empire. They basically came here to chop down all the sandalwood. So sandalwood was the big export. There's almost no sandalwood trees left now. There is a bit of colonial history, but it's not a big colonial gem. It's not Penang or somewhere with a lot of colonial remains. And also,
Okay.
Dili's had a bit of a quite traumatic history. During World War II, the Japanese invaded and they bombed the place. Then the Allies came to get the Japanese out and they bombed the place. And then when the Portuguese left in 1975, 9 days later, the Indonesians invaded and destroyed the place. And then when the Indonesians left in 1999, they destroyed, estimates are up to 80% of all the buildings in Timor-Leste. So there are a
Hmm.
few historic buildings left. Some of the ones that are there, like the government palace, they've been rebuilt since 1999. So you don't expect to see hundreds of years old kind of buildings. Like the oldest building in Dili is from the late 19th century. But there is some interesting stuff, and there is definitely a bit of a Portuguese kind of feel to some of the kind of architecture. The Indonesian occupation is the kind of key piece of Timorese history to understand. It explains a lot about even how Timor operates now and the political systems now. So Timor is occupied. There is the National Resistance Museum. It's an excellent museum. It's quite harrowing, but it tells the story of what happened, and that's a really good place to get your bearings around Timor history. There's the Shager exhibition, which is an old prison. The Timorese put other Timorese in there, or the Portuguese put Timorese in there, the Timorese put Timorese in there, and then when the Indonesians turned up, the Indonesians put Timorese in there. It's got quite a convoluted history of bad things happening. It's not quite the killing fields of Phnom Penh, but it can be close. You go in a very small enclosed cell. This is where they held 30, 40 people in the darkness and some quite horrific conditions. So that's quite good for experiencing that kind of history firsthand. And then there's Santa Cruz Cemetery. So if anybody has heard of Timor-Leste, particularly in the 90s, it was quite a big topic in the United Nations. There was a thing called the Santa Cruz massacre, which happened in 1991, in which Indonesian troops fired on, basically, they were Timorese who'd gone to a funeral for a Timorese who'd been killed by the Indonesian soldiers, and they were walking from the church to the cemetery, and on the way, Indonesian soldiers opened fire. There was a British cameraman, Match Style, who managed to capture this on film, VHS in those days, and he buried the VHS in the cemetery because he knew the Indonesian troops would confiscate his camera. And he came back up under the cover of darkness a few days later and retrieved the video and then distributed it around the world. And that really got the attention, and the independence process really gained a lot of ground after that
Hmm.
event. So those are probably the three kind of key historic sites in Dili. And then a bit of history and a bit of walking and history and nature is if you go out to the east of Dili. Again, there are microlets. So microlets are these local buses. They're very frequent. If you wait more than 2 minutes, that's unusual. They're very
Oh,
cheap.
wow. Okay.
Yeah, they're literally like you can normally see the next one when the one in front of you is leaving, which is great. I do the good things first. So they're very frequent. They're very cheap. They're 25 US cents a trip. So that is pretty cheap. And they have very good coverage. So you can pretty much get everywhere in Dili city using a microlet. Like the number 10 will take you out west, and the number 12 will take you out east, and the number 1 will take you down sort of southeast and things. And they have a standard route. The downside is, well, one complication is I've never been in a city, including Wellington, which is notorious, with as many one-way streets. So
Hmm.
you can't get off a microlet and get back on it at the point you got off it because it's a one-way street. So it does take a little bit of getting your head around, and there is some good kind of Google Map resources, the routes to make sure you can get around town. They're not very big. They're basically sort of small minivans. So they're fine
Mm-hmm.
for Timorese size people, but for Malay, I'm a 6 foot Malay. My head is touching the roof. If I was any taller, it's not super comfortable, and so you just have to bear that in mind. And also, the Timorese love their music, and they love playing the music loud, and the music tends to be quite like it tends to have a lot of bass. So even those microlets are literally. I, I rode past one yesterday. I get around Dili on the motorbike, and I was like, why is there a microlet sat in the middle of the main road? And as I drove past it, I saw that the axle had literally fallen out of the back of the microlet. The whole thing was. So they don't spend a lot of money on the maintenance, but they do spend a lot of money, it seems, on the sound system. So every time I'm on a microlet, I know it's fine the first couple of times, but when you live here for a year, you're kind of like every time I get in the microlet, I'd highly recommend you bring earplugs to Timor-Leste because they do like playing the music at random times, and it is a busy, noisy city in Dili. And even I've hiked and camped in some quite remote places, and even though they've got no electricity, somehow they can power the large speakers and play the music. So I get it. It's a poor country. They love the music. It's fine, but just bring some earplugs. So anyway, the microlets, they're a very good system for getting around. Also, actually, make sure you've got your Google Maps open because as a Malay, the windows are sort of at your sort of stomach level. So it's actually quite hard to see where you are once you're inside. So you can basically sit there on your phone trying to see where you are because you've got no idea where you are. And then actually also you can get on and off wherever you want. You just tap the coin there's a metal bar and you just tap your 25 cents coin and then the microlet will literally just swerve over to the left, like damn to the cyclists or pedestrians or anybody who's in their way. They just pull over to the left and you can get out. So, I mean, it's great. It's like door to door, very efficient, but not maybe the most comfortable form of transport. So, anyway, you get the number 12 and then you go out east and you go out to a place called Cristo Rey. That is home to one of, I've read it might be the second or the third. It's definitely one of the largest statues of Jesus in the world. It's 27 meters high and it faces towards Indonesia because the Indonesian government paid for it to be installed. I think it opened in the mid-90s and it's 27 meters high because it was to denote that Timor-Leste or Timor or East Timor at the time was going to be the 27th province of Indonesia. So it's got a beautiful beach actually at the bottom, Cristo Rey Beach, which has got quite good snorkeling, and you can get a coconut for $1, and it's quite a nice spot. But yeah, as I mentioned, there is no changing facilities. The public toilet's pretty sketchy. It's pretty adventure beaching, but it is a nice spot. And then they've built Stations of the Cross. So these are the 14
Okay.
Stations of the Cross that exist in Jerusalem, and there are a lot of them in Timor-Leste. And so there are these 14 stations to cross, and you basically go up about 300 or 400 steps, and you get to Cristo Rey, which is at the head of the peninsula, and you get beautiful views of Dili and the surrounding area. And then you can come down the other side, or there's a road around the bottom of the peninsula that takes you to what's called Back Beach. Now, Back Beach probably has the best snorkeling in Dili itself, and it's beautiful white sandy beach, and it's a very nice place. Again, there's no shade or facilities or anything, but it's a nice place to go to.
And one thing that you are hinting at here, but didn't say, with the Stations of the Cross and the Cristo Rey and the Portuguese, is that after they were there for 400 years, the island is predominantly Catholic, or
Correct.
the country is predominantly Catholic.
Correct. Yeah. So Timor Leste is the second most Catholic country in the world after the
The
Vatican
Vatican.
City. Exactly. So, it's pretty Catholic. It's 98% Catholic. So you will see churches everywhere. Sunday morning
Hmm.
is very quiet because everybody's at church. It's quite a conservative country in terms of dress. So don't bring your thongs to the beach.
You're saying don't bring my shoes or don't bring my really skimpy swimsuit.
Skimpy swimsuit,
Okay.
your jandals, your thongs, your whatever you want to call your like your footwear is completely fine. But when you're going into the
Okay.
water, if you're a woman, you want to cover yourself reasonably. They're quite conservative from that perspective. But actually, walking around, so shorts, everywhere shorts is fine. I've never had any
Okay.
issues going into any churches in shorts, so there's no issues and actually I've been to the big mosque here in shorts, and that's fine. So that's quite casual from that perspective. But as usual, particularly more so for women than men, skimpy tops, and if you're on the beach, just maybe a sarong or something once you're out the water.
Okay.
So interesting, actually, on the religious side of things. So you talk about the Portuguese colonisation. They weren't actually that Catholic. By the time they left after 450 years, they hadn't done that good a job at converting the locals. What really converted the locals to Catholicism was the Indonesian occupation. Because
Huh.
Indonesia, yeah, so Timor was actually like in 1970s, I know half the people said they were Catholic, and now 98% of people say they're Catholic. So during the Indonesian occupation, Indonesia said you had to pick a religion. You had to be Muslim, which they didn't want to be Muslim because that was the religion of the occupiers. You had to be
Right.
Buddhist. Well, actually, Buddhism, there was a lot of Balinese soldiers based in Timor, so much
Hmm.
so that there is the third largest Balinese temple outside of Bali is in Dili. It's quite an interesting place to visit that's being renovated at the moment. So Buddhism wasn't kind of attractive. Oh, sorry, Bali is Hinduism, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. So Hinduism was not attractive, and obviously being Jewish, there's not a history of that. So they all became Catholic because they had to pick a religion, so they picked Catholicism. And
Huh.
then the church in Timor, a bit like in Poland during communism, the
Hmm.
church became one of the major organizing forces working with the Indonesian government, but also kind of supporting the independence movement. And so they have a lot of credibility from that period.
Hmm.
So yeah, Timor was very Catholic, but it's a new thing. It's quite an interesting history.
Hmm. Interesting. If you've listened to Amateur Traveler for any length of time at all, you know that I am not a fan of overpacking. It's easier to get through airports when you're packing light. But what if you're a golfer? What if you're going on one of those golf vacations where you really want to bring your own clubs? The solution for that is today's sponsor, which is Ship Sticks. Skip the airport stress and costly airline fees with complimentary insurance, real time tracking, dedicated support, and on time delivery of your golf clubs. Just schedule your shipment, attach your label, and ShipSticks handles the rest, delivering your gear directly to your destination. ShipSticks offers white glove shipping for golf clubs and luggage. Travel worldwide without luggage. ShipSticks delivers to 180 countries for a hassle free, gear free journey. Right now, ShipSticks is offering our listeners 20% off your first shipment when you go to shipsticks.com and use code AMATEUR. Go to shipsticks.com and use code AMATEUR to get 20% off your first shipment and save yourself the hassle this golf season. That's shipsticks.com. Make sure you use the code AMATEUR so they know we sent you. And thanks to ShipSticks for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike Big Wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
So Dili, I mean, there's quite good. It's probably about the only place in the country with decent restaurants and decent hotels. So you can take advantage of that. There are no real major chains here, but there are some reasonably good 4-star local hotels. There are some quite good Timorese owned and run restaurants, the kind of Proemas, Deliciouses of the world. Timorese cuisine is, as you can imagine, quite similar to kind of Indonesian cuisine. It's very heavy on the rice. There's a few Portuguese influences, and there are some Portuguese restaurants. And I wouldn't come to Timor-Leste for the food, but you can certainly eat pretty well here, and the portion sizes tend to be quite generous. So that's definitely an option if you're into food. And then, yeah, Dili, I like exploring the back streets. And to me, one of the things I love about Timor is there isn't an Angkor Wat. There isn't the one
Hmm.
site in the country that you must see. But there's just lots of small stuff. And that's why I like just wandering the streets and just seeing how people live their lives. And there'll be a small chapel on the corner or a shrine. And actually, Catholicism, they've actually inherited some of their pre-religious, more animalistic beliefs. So they have not so much in Dili, but when you go outside Dili, you'll see a lot of what they call umalulik. And these are traditional Timorese sacred houses. They tend to be raised off the ground, and they have a lot of ceremonies relating to the harvest. So things like the first corn picked of the year, and they have ceremonies, and every Timorese can basically trace their family back to an umalulik, so they get passed down through the bloodlines, and one member of the family becomes the guardian of the structure. And so that's quite interesting culture. And what they've done, I've seen in a number of places, they've kind of combine that with the Catholicism. So you'll go into a Catholic church and it'll have your statues of Jesus, and Virgin Mary is very, very important here. There's a lot of shrines to Virgin Mary in like a man-made cave structure. But then you'll also see traditional Timorese, you'll like corn hanging down and these kind of interesting three-pronged wooden trees. And so they've done this interesting combination between the two. So that's probably Dili. So really, I think a day or 2 days in Dili is probably sufficient to see what most people would want to see. As I say, go for a walk is a good way of doing it. Cristo Rey is obvious, bit of the historic sites. Just walking along the waterfront, to be honest, there's always something happening, and you can get a coconut and you just enjoy taking in the atmosphere. That's probably my Dili recommendation. So, moving on from Dili, Aturu Island, or Aturo Island, depending on your pronunciation. So, Timor-Leste, well, it's half of an island that has two islands of its own. So, it has Jacko Island, which is in the far east of the country, which does come up on adventure travellers' itineraries, but it requires between a 12 and 16-hour return journey on half the roads are fine, half the roads are quite bad. So it's a long way to go for a nice beach with nothing to do. So people do talk about Jacko. It's a 3-day trip, and on a value for time and money, I think you could spend 3 days in Timor doing other stuff, but people do enjoy the experience and you do kind of get out and about. So that's kind of the other island. So Aotearoa is the main island people visit. Getting there is relatively straightforward. The ferries go on a Tuesday, a Thursday, and a Saturday. So you can do a day trip. There's the normal ferry, which leaves on a Tuesday and a Saturday. It takes about 3 hours each way. And it goes and comes in the same day. So you get out there, you get 2-3 hours, and then you get the ferry back. Or there is a fast boat called the Dragon Boat, which is an hour and a half. And so that leaves a little bit earlier. So that gives you a bit more time for a day trip. But really, I think if you've got the time, I'd recommend you go and spend a few days there. You can really kind of enjoy island time. And so you just need to think about that. There are flights, I believe, on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And actually, flying around Timor, there is a national airline there, Dili, but the domestic flights is with MAF, which is Mission Aviation Friendship, which is a religious charity that runs basically medical flights. So it's a bit like the Flying Doctors in Australia, but they run flights in like Papua New Guinea. And I'd never come across this before, but quite poor places in the world, they run a medical service, and to help pay for that, they run scheduled flights.
And these are small planes from what I'm seeing.
Correct. These are like 6-seater planes, basically. So, the flights are probably a maximum of an hour. And I flew, for example, from Shuai down in Kovalima, which is in the southwest of the country, because I just needed to get back with work. And it was absolutely beautiful. They're normally about $80 each way US, but Timor is a very mountainous country. Over half the land is at a 40-degree angle or more, and the roads can be quite hairy. And the road infrastructure is not great. So seeing it from a plane, even though it is a small plane, is actually my guidebook. I put it as one of the top 10 experiences. It is a really good way of just kind of getting your bearings and looking around the country. And if you do fly to Aotearoa, it is a beautiful flight. If you get the boat ride, it's also a very nice boat ride. But yeah, so that's kind of how you get there. In terms of where to stay on the island, there are a few resorts, and they tend to be all-inclusive. And there are also a few homestays. Now,
Okay.
this is a sort of Timor thing. Even though, as I mentioned earlier, like this is a tourism hub, I think there's one restaurant on the island that may or may not be open. This is not like you're going to sit on the, like, you just need to manage your expectations. You stay in, and when I say a resort, to the place I've stayed 9 times now and I really love and people really rate is Barry's place. Barry's an Australian who moved here 20 years ago, and he runs this, it's more of like an eco-tourism kind of setup. So you've got a hut, there's no air conditioning because there's only power on the island for 12 hours a day, and that's only to half the island. And actually, so there's no power at night. So if you do have somewhere with air conditioning at night, they have to use a generator, which isn't very ecotourism. So, and the food is good. You'll normally get like some fresh fish and chicken and some vegetables and salads to go with it, but it's not high cuisine. And you have a bucket shower, which is fine. There's holes in the bottom of the bucket, which is great. You lift up your bucket and it turns into a sort of shower, and then you fill it up again in the water trough. But it is like right by the beach. There's also a couple of Aotearoa Dive Resort and Compass, similar setups. They're much more kind of diving focused. So people come to Aotearoa primarily. So the diving is, I've done a bit of diving, but I've spoken to people who've done a lot of diving, and they say the corals in particular are some of the healthiest corals that they've seen anywhere. And they actually did an underwater survey of the fish life, and the reefs around Aotearoa Island have, I think they said, some of the most biodiverse reefs in the world. So they counted like 300 or 400 different species of fish. If you're very, very, very lucky, you might see a turtle. There aren't the kind of the big fish, but there's a lot of small stuff. I was there with my sister and brother-in-law a couple of weeks ago, and we saw an octopus, we saw a sea snake, there's some amazing giant clams, and lots of variety of coral. And then if you dive, there's a lot more to see from there. And one of the great things about the island is it's so accessible. If you go to the Great Barrier Reef or even somewhere like Fiji, you often have quite a long boat ride to get out to where you want to dive or snorkel. It can be 45 minutes to an hour. Here, 5 minutes is it. There's actually good snorkeling just off the beach. You can just go off the beach, and there's beautiful starfish and there's some interesting coral. The better snorkeling is out at the inner reef, which is literally a 5-minute boat ride with a local fisherman. You can organise that through Barry's Place or one of the resorts. It's phenomenal. It's very shallow, so only a couple of metres off the coral, and it's just fantastic. And then if you go further out, and also on the west coast, it's a bit more of an adventure to get there, but somewhere like Aotearoa on the west coast, they have what do you call it, like a wall. So you go out maybe 30 to 50 metres from the coast, you get the cliff, so you see the coral disappearing, and it's a bit eerie, but it's pretty cool as a snorkeler being able to see it going off, and then that's where a lot of the diving happens. So a lot of the diving, you don't need to be that deep, 15 to 20 metres, you'll see lots of really good stuff, and so that is a real highlight. So yeah, the diving is great, and the snorkeling is just phenomenal. There's also quite good hiking on the island. It is hot, but there is kind of quite good hiking. You can get up into the hills, and quite a popular hike is to walk over to the west coast of the island. So east coast is where Beloy is, which is where the ferries go into and where the accommodation is. But if you do a sort of 3 to 4 hour hike, you can get over onto the west coast, which has got quite different scenery. It's a lot more tropical. The east coast would be quite dry. The west coast is more kind of Jurassic Park-esque with lots of palm trees and foliage. So there's quite a lot to go and do and see on the island. So yeah, I'd recommend definitely spend a few days there.
Anything else we're going to do on the island?
That's about it, to be honest. It's a quiet place, apart from the music that occasionally plays. But other than that, it's a pretty quiet place. So then going back to the mainland, so if you go south from Dili, you go up into the hills. Now, Timor-Leste, I mean, I love hiking. I've hiked on 5 continents, and I have to say the hiking in Timor-Leste is world-class. My hiking, I've done day trips. I did an 8-day hike, actually, across the entire island. So basically from Dili on the north coast to Batano on the south coast. That was quite a big hike. And I've done a number of kind of 3 and 4 day, multi-day hikes. And I live in New Zealand. The hiking in New Zealand is phenomenal. I've hiked in Australia, I've hiked in everywhere apart from North America, actually. I've done South America and I've done Africa. There's too many bears in North America. It kind of puts me off a little bit. But the hiking here, especially if you can deal with the heat and the humidity, the hiking is pretty incredible here. And it is very adventure hiking. Like, there are no facilities, there are no signage. You have to go with a local hiking company. The only one that really exists is a company called Eco Discovery. I highly recommend them. They're the ones I've done all my trips with. And they're basically it. There's an Australian company, Mad Dog Adventures, who do one kind of hiking route, but Eco Discovery can do customized itineraries to go anywhere basically around the island. So what I didn't know until I came to Timor was like, oh my God, there's amazing hiking. This is great. The highest point in Timor-Leste, Mount Ramelau, is nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. So for half of a small island at the bottom end of Southeast Asia, like, the scenery, A, it is spectacular, and B, it's very varied. Like, for a relatively small place, there is a lot of variety. And I've looked around and I thought, I'm in the Swiss Alps. This looks like the Swiss Alps. Or I've been in a place and go, this is quite different. This is very volcanic, rocky, outcroppy kind of setup. Then you can get down into the rice fields. There are a number of hot springs around. Like, there is a lot of variety for quite a small place. And I think going around on foot is a good way of doing it, because the roading infrastructure is improving, but it's pretty poor. So it can be quite difficult to get around the island. So hiking, yeah, around that kind of Mount Ramelau area, which is the highest peak, within 3 to 4 days walking in north, south, east, west, that's all fantastic hiking. I've done a lot of it. It's varied and it's really interesting. And you walk through a community that won't see foreigners. They might see the odd volunteer who comes out once a year, but I've been literally chased down the path by this Timorese teenager who's going, Malay, Malay, photo, photo, photo. And they were like, she brought me back to her house and I met her whole family and all her sisters. And I had to get a group photo with like 15 of them. Timorese are very friendly people. I've been in a lot of countries and Timorese are super friendly and they're not over tourists. Like, particularly if you get outside of Dili, it's a novelty. And they do love their selfies and they do love their photos. I don't really like taking photos of people because I don't want people necessarily taking photos of me. But I'll be what they're like, photo mister, take a photo. And I'm like, I'm not going to give you I can't give you the photo, but you still want me to take a photo with you. So it is still a bit of a novelty. So that is one of the real attractions of Timor. Oh, just a little segue. So the language outside of Dili and even in Dili, English is limited. So the official languages of Timor-Leste is Teton. It's quite a simple language to learn. It's got a mixture of Portuguese, Bahasa Indonesian, and native words. And then Portuguese is the other official language. But Portuguese, even though it's an official language, it isn't generally spoken. So I know Portuguese visitors who assume that everybody will speak Portuguese, and they don't. So Bahasa Indonesian is very widely spoken, and Teton, and actually there's about 25 local languages in addition to Teton. Like on Aotearoa Island, Teton isn't their first language. So I'm speaking to them in my Teton thinking, oh, I've been here a while, I've learnt the lingo, and they're looking at me with a blank face because they speak a different language entirely. So language can be a bit of an issue trying to communicate with people. So that is definitely something to bear in mind. In terms of getting around Timor, independent travel is possible but difficult. So you do need to be pretty adventurous. Dili's fine. You can get around Dili. You can get Aotearoa's pretty straightforward. Beyond that, so to get around the rest of the island, they've got these local buses. Volunteer Service Abroad, who I'm here with, their policy is almost effectively do not get on a local bus. So it's kind of... Which is interesting because the Peace Corps say, do not get on a motorbike. We will fire you if we see you on a motorbike. But please do use the local buses. So it's interesting how you've got two Western volunteer organisations that have got completely different perspectives on how one should get around Timor-Leste. The challenge of the local buses, basically, they all go from Dili. And you can't get to Jacko Island very easily. But you can get to all the major towns of Timor on the local buses. The challenges of these local buses is they all tend to leave first thing in the morning. Now... some of them, I think the bus to Maliana, when somebody told me first thing in the morning, I thought, maybe 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. 3:30 a.m. they leave. It isn't very user-friendly. They have the old trick, which happens a lot in places like this, which is they don't tend to leave until they're completely full. And when I mean completely full, until the chickens have been loaded, they've got 2 motorbikes strapped to the back, there's a couple of people on the roof, there's about 5 people hanging out the side. So it's not the most comfortable experience. You can't generally see out the windows because the windows are blackened to try and keep them a bit cooler. They do play very loud music. So, I mean, it's funny, I read this blog post of somebody who considered himself an adventure traveller, and the blog was basically like, I was an adventure traveller until I got to Timor-Leste, and then Timor-Leste broke me, and he realised he liked adventure travel, but he liked organised adventure travel. He did one bus journey for about 3 hours, and he was like, never again. So that is something, I mean, people do. I mean, the Lonely Planet writer for Timor-Leste, Jane, was out here a few weeks ago, and she used local buses, and she also did some hitchhiking, which is possible, but there's not a lot of traffic outside Dili, so you might be waiting a while. It is doable, but just recognise it is an experience. A couple of options. I live here and I have a motorbike, and people do rent scooters. Scooters are doable on the sealed roads, which you can get probably 2 or 3 hours any direction out of Dili and you're okay. But beyond that, the roads start to get pretty rough. People take scooters to crazy places, and it's not something I necessarily advise, in which case a motorbike is better. There is a company called, I think, Timor Motorbike Tours and Adventures or something, and they do group motorbike trips, so that's quite a good way to doing it. But if you don't know how to ride a motorbike, I wouldn't recommend that Timor-Leste is the place to learn, or a scooter. Like, it's not Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi, you know, it's not Vietnam in terms of the volume, but it's still Southeast Asia. The road rules are different. Like, if you're on a roundabout, the people coming into the roundabout seem to have priority over the people who are already on the roundabout. I've gotten used to it, but it is definitely an experience in Dili. Once you leave Dili, there's a lot less traffic, but the roads can expect big potholes, random sections of stuff that's been washed away, dirt roads. Like, it is quite adventurous. So if you've got those skills and experience, then a motorbike is probably the best way to get around Timor-Leste, because you can go on all the bad roads only in the dry season, just to flag that. So,
And when is the dry season versus the wet season?
yeah, so the dry season is basically May to November, and then the wet season is December to April. And it is quite binary. So dry season is, in 6 months, it probably rained, or certainly in Dili, it maybe rained half a dozen times, briefly. It can get quite dusty, though, and it can get quite dry in terms of the landscape, but it's pretty reliable that you know it's not going to rain and the weather's going to be basically the same every day. And coming from a country where I look at the weather forecast 3 times a day, Timorese, they've never looked at the weather forecast in their life, because you don't need to. In the dry season, the weather's like this, in the wet season, the weather's like this, and that's all you need to know. So, yeah, the dry season is the time to visit. If you go earlier in the season, like May, June, the landscape is more lush because it's had all the end of the wet season, but there do tend to be more mosquitoes around. So there is no malaria in Timor, but there is definitely dengue fever and chikungunya and typhoid and the tropical diseases you'd expect to have. And most of those are mosquito-borne. Peak mosquito season is probably February through to May. And then towards the end of dry season, so the landscape is more parched, so it's not quite as attractive, but very few mosquitoes around in September, October, November kind of time. Then when the wet season starts, it was like a switch turns on, and it's grey and overcast every day. It's muggy. It was muggy all year round, but it's more muggy, more humid in the wet season. And it doesn't rain all day. Like Singapore, places like that, you know. About 5 or 6 o'clock, probably every 2 or 3 days, it will rain. And when it rains, it's torrential for an hour or two. And maybe once every few weeks, you might get a longer period of rain or a little bit of rain in the morning. But the main thing, particularly as a tourist, is that it is overcast. And so if you're trying to take photos or snorkeling or diving, it's not as good then. And getting out to Attu Island can be a bit more challenging because the ferries and the flights are not as reliable during the wet season.
Okay.
So getting around. Wet season also, the roads literally become impassable. Like the road, or what is called a road, along the southern end of the island is literally impassable because a lot of the rivers are not bridged. And they just become flooded and very hard to get around. Like Dili is fine, the sealed roads are fine, but if you go up into the mountains, it's going to be raining every day and you won't see anything. So that's kind of something to consider.
Hey, Atlanta, Apple is open for small business. That's right. We're here to make starting and running your business simpler. With privacy and security built in on all devices, it's easy for you to protect your customers' data. And if you need hardware or software support, you'll get advice from business experts at no cost whatsoever. So you can focus more on the soup du jour and less on, the other stuff. At Apple, we're open for your small business. Go to apple.com/small business or visit an Apple store to learn more.
Your neighborhood just got cooler with Kroger Delivery's refrigerated trucks. Simply order groceries at the same great prices online as in-store, and we'll bring them to you fresh every time. And if that wasn't cool enough, you can now earn 4 times the fuel points after 4 with your digital coupon. Choose a next-day Kroger delivery time slot for 4 p.m. or later on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Must deliver by February 4th. Restrictions apply. See Kroger.com for details.
The preferred way probably to get around is to do it with a local tour operator. And I've got a few listed on the website. There's probably only about 8 in the country. It's not a big tourism industry. What you tend to get is a driver and a car, which is a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and the driver is often the guide as well. There's no accreditation system in Timor-Leste, so nobody is a trained guide. You don't have to pass an exam or anything. Anybody can call themselves a guide. Just be careful of that. And you're probably looking at somewhere between $2 and $250 a day US dollars for the driver and the car and the support network. So it's not that cheap, but it is a safe way to get around. Normally in these vehicles, you can get 3 people. So if you're a group of 3, that would be more cost effective. Where it gets difficult is I see people turn up to Dili and they're by themselves or they're a couple, and particularly if they're backpackers and they can't afford to hire a driver and they get stuck. They do Dili and they go to Aturu, which is fine. That's a bit of a slice of Timor-Leste, but it gets hard to get out around the mainland unless you can do it with a tour operator.
Okay.
So that's what's considered. So on the money side of things, so the currency they use is the US dollar.
Oh, okay.
Generally, $10 and $20 notes are the most commonly used. I never see 50s or 100s. They will accept them, but they're pretty rare. $5 are like gold dust. If you get a $5 note, hold on to that. And then coins. The US denomination coins are not acceptable. They have local Timorese coins. So you have, I think it's called Savitos, probably from Portuguese. So they go from like 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents, etc. So you bring your US dollar notes, but don't bring your coins. Now, it is a small island. It's like New Zealand. New Zealand's a small island a long way from anywhere, so everything's expensive. Timor's an even smaller island with even less of an economy. And so anything that's imported, which is most things, is expensive. So this is not your cheap Southeast Asia destination. This is not Indonesia. This is not Bali. This is not wherever. This is Timor is, from a value for money perspective, you pay more and you get less, which is my sales pitch for Timor-Leste. But what I would argue is you get something different that can be difficult to get elsewhere these days, in these days of kind of over-tourism. So you have to accept that you're here for the experience, and there is a premium. It's ironic, you pay a premium for the lack of tourism infrastructure. Which is a bit slightly ironic, but that's just how it works. And you just have to accept. So if I go out for a meal at a restaurant, like you can go to a local warung and you pay $2 or something, $2 or $3 for rice and some chicken. A more of a named restaurant, you might pay $10 or $15 for a main course US. So that's not a cheap meal. It's not it's not Singaporean cost, but it isn't a cheap destination to visit. You do it because of an experience. There's not so many other people here. Okay, so from Dili, as I say, if you head south, you go into the mountains. Mubisi is the main spot there. They have these things called pousadas, which is a Portuguese term. Basically, it's often where the Portuguese colonial administrator would have their house in the best location in the town, which is generally on top of the hill with an amazing view. So in Mubisi, in Mubara, there's a few around Timor, there's these pousadas. A lot of them at the moment are being renovated, but some of them are open as hotels, and they tend to be in very good kind of locations. So that's one of the things you can see. There tends to be local markets at least once or twice a week in pretty much all towns, and they're just quite interesting to see kind of what's going on and how to buy things. Supermarkets outside of Dili are almost non-existent. On the money side of things, ATMs. There are plenty of ATMs in Dili. They normally have money in them, which is good. Outside of Dili, it's not always guaranteed depending on the countries, but when you get outside of Dili, there's a handful of the major towns that have got ATMs, and then that's about it. I'd recommend that you get all the cash you need. Timor-Leste is very much a cash culture, credit
Hmm.
cards are very rarely accepted. So in major hotels or high-end hotels and high-end restaurants in Dili, they may accept credit card. If they do, they'll only accept Visa. MasterCard
Hmm.
for many years was not accepted anywhere in Timor-Leste. It is now accepted by BNU's ATM machines, but they charge like a 2%, 2.7% commission, so they pay a lot. So if you leave your MasterCard at home, bring cash or bring your Visa card and get money out of the ATM when you get here. And as you get outside Dili, your food options get pretty limited. You may need to book food ahead of time if you're going to stay in accommodation in one of the more remote areas. The accommodation is probably the only place to eat, and you may need to give them a heads up that you're coming to prepare dinner because you'll probably be the only guests. In Dili, you've got some international, probably more 3-star, a few 4-star kind of hotels. No 5-star hotels yet. Outside of that, it's generally guest houses. You can probably expect to pay somewhere between $25 and $40 a night for bed and breakfast, effectively. Some of the breakfasts are good, some are less good. The facilities are also quite variable. I'd always recommend taking a travel towel. You're not necessarily guaranteed to get a towel. Take your own toilet paper. You're not necessarily guaranteed to get toilet paper. So they're quite variable. The tourism industry here is very in its infancy, and almost no Timorese have been overseas because it's a poor country. And so they've never had the experience of being a tourist.
Hmm.
There's a lot of education, a lot of maturity still to come in terms of the hospitality and tourism industry because they just don't know what Malay is, not something they're familiar with. So just patience goes a long way in Timor, and just managing expectations. So I'm saying it's an amazing place, but you just need to manage your expectations about what you get.
Okay.
So going from Dili, if you go to the west, you go through, so there's 13 what they call municipalities in Timor-Leste. So you will travel through Likisar. Now, Likisar is quite a nice day trip out of Dili if you're interested in Portuguese history. So in Alpelo, there is an old Portuguese prison, which is about the only tourism site in Timor-Leste which actually has information boards with information about the site. Everywhere else, there is basically no information, which is one of the reasons why I wrote a guidebook, Exploring Timor-Leste. It's $3 on Amazon. I'm not trying to make any money. I'm just trying to get the information out there. And it was trying to get blood out of a stone, trying to get information about Timor-Leste and the history and the places. Very difficult. There's very few books about Timor-Leste. Yeah, it's quite a challenge. So I've tried to find what I can. Then you go to Likisar town, which has got some old sites. There is quite a lot. I mean, somebody sort of said to me, said, all the things you recommend in Timor-Leste are basically churches and massacre sites and cemeteries, which unfortunately, that is the history of the country. It's got quite a tragic history. And I don't think I've ever been anywhere with quite as many cemeteries or massacre sites, unfortunately. Particularly in 1999, when the Indonesians left, the Indonesian militia, there's some really bad things happened. And so that is something which is recognised by the Timorese as part of their history, and so it is something that is worth seeing. But again, there's very little information. It will say, this is the massacre site of in Likisar in 1999, and there's not a lot about what happened. And then if you go a bit further out to the west, you go to Mubara. Lake Mubara is a beautiful lake. There are surprisingly few lakes in Timor, but that is one of the great ones. And in Mubara itself, it's got an old fort, which was actually built by the Dutch, and then they did a swap with the Portuguese. So back in the day, the Dutch and the Portuguese basically fought between themselves over control of the spice trade and the Spice Islands and this part of the world. So this is why this bit is Portuguese, and the rest of West Timor and the rest of Indonesia was Dutch. There's an interesting site, particularly of relevance to Australians. They will have heard of a place called Balibo. So Balibo is probably 3 hours drive west from Dili. That's famous for what they call the Balibo Five, and there's a movie called Balibo Five which tells the story. So these were 5 Australian-based, but they were a combination of British, Australian, and New Zealander journalists who were based in Balibo when the Indonesian troops invaded in 1975, and they were basically executed by the Indonesians, and it's all covered up. Bit of a tragic history again, but they have got quite a good museum and information about that. And there is Balibo Fort Hotel, which I think is the second oldest Portuguese fort in Timor, and they've converted it into quite a flash hotel. So that's a destination out west. Then if you go from Dili and you go to the east, you go through Manatutu, which has got a few sites of interest. I mean, a lot of it depends on your tolerance for churches. I've got quite a high tolerance for churches. I realise they're not for everybody, because all the schools and the government buildings throughout Timor are standard design. Presumably, they got a donor from UN or some donor agency, and they have literally, if you go to any village in Timor, and the school is identical, and the local administration building is identical. The churches are all different. Pretty much every church in Timor is unique, and so I find that interesting, but they're not European churches. It's a poor country. They do spend a lot of money on churches. There are some quite spectacular churches being built in the last 10, 15 years, but they've got amazing statues inside and gold-covered things, but they're kind of interesting to visit. So you head through Manatutu, it's got a few sites there, and then you go to Balcao. So Balcao is a very popular, it's a little bit far for a day trip, it's an excellent 2-day trip from Dili. So Balcao is the second biggest city, it's only about 20,000 people, so it's a lot smaller than Dili, but for the size, it's probably got the highest density of historic sites. So there's the Posada de Balcao, which is quite a nice hotel. They've got the only real public swimming pool in the country. You rarely say the swimming pool is the highlight of a place to visit, but it's actually a really nice swimming pool. It's spring-fed. I think it's Mondays and Thursdays. They drain the pool to clean it, and then they refill it. So the other days, it's like 50 cents to go in, and it's a nice pool, and it's quite a nice experience to visit there. There's a bit of historic sites within Balcao. The drive there is beautiful drive, so you're going along the coast, and they've recently built this, they call it Snake Road, which is one of these coastal roads that kind of wiggles around the side of the hillside, and you get really nice views. That's quite a cool spot to be, and you can go down to Waterloo Beach, which is a beautiful palm tree beach. This is a good point to talk about crocodiles. So before you go in the water, listen to what I'm going to say about the crocodiles. So at Atu Island, there is no crocodiles. We don't see any crocodiles. Between the mainland Timor and Atu Island is the Wetter Strait, which has got a 3,000 metre deep trench. So the crocodiles, for whatever reason, they don't cross there. In Dili itself, and heading out towards Likisar and Manatutu to the west and the east, the crocodile risk is minimal. They've occasionally seen the odd crocodile, and then the locals will go and run down and feed it chickens, and it's a bit of a tourist attraction for them. But you're very, very, very unlikely to see crocodiles around that area. But weirdly, as soon as you get either further west of Mubara or further east of Balcao, the crocodiles start appearing. And then the crocodiles basically build in density. When you get to the eastern end of the island, there's quite a lot. And the south coast, you do not go in the water on the south coast. And even you do not go in the rivers on the south coast because they have crocodile stacks. Now, Timorese believe that their ancestors are crocodiles. So their logic is only bad people get eaten by crocodiles. So if somebody got eaten by a crocodile, they probably did something naughty, like stole something, or they were a bad person. So that's the logic that applies. But they do venerate crocodiles in their culture, which means they don't manage the crocodile numbers. So during Indonesian times, Indonesians would shoot all the crocodiles. Now they've been left to breed, and so they're actually a bit of a problem, particularly on the south coast. So that's worth considering. But as I say, at Uruguay, you're going to probably go and around Dili. The beaches are perfectly fine and safe, so that's all good. In terms of an off-the-beaten-track place to go to, I would suggest Akusi. So Akusi is an enclave completely surrounded by Indonesia. Yeah, there's not that many enclaves in the world, and to be honest, most of the enclaves, like Russian separatists, like the visa situation is really complicated. It's the ones in Georgia and the ones in Armenia, and they're very difficult to visit. Timor-Leste is the easiest conclave in the world to visit, I reckon, because it is part of Timor-Leste. You do not need a separate visa or anything to get there. Historic reasons, so the Portuguese first landed in Akusi, so that's when they started. But then there was this tussle with the Dutch, and they took the land, and it became Indonesian and Timor-Leste. So it's this enclave surrounded on all sides on land by Indonesia. There are 3 ways to get there. You can get there by probably about 12-hour bus from Dili. That can be a bit complicated because you have to go into Indonesia and out of Indonesia. So depending on your passport and your visa status, you may need to get visas to go through. So it can be a bit expensive, and it can take a bit of time getting across the border. Particularly, I think it's either half an hour, 1 hour time difference between Timor-Leste and Indonesia, or that West Timor part. So you can hit the border and you arrive at lunchtime, Timor time. So you wait, and everything closes at lunchtime. Then it opens and you go to the Indonesian side. Well, now it's lunchtime in Indonesia, so everything's closed. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend people do the overland, but you can also, there's a ferry which goes 2 or 3 days a week, but that takes 14 hours. And the only berths are if you basically pay one of the cabin crew to use their cabin. So I know people have done it, they haven't got a lot of sleep, and it's about $15. But you don't need any visas, you just use Timorese visa to go through. The best way I reckon is to fly. So Air Dili, they fly on Mondays and Fridays. It's $20 one way, and it's about a 20-minute flight, and that will take you straight into Akusi. Now, Akusi, because it's an enclave, and with politics, and there's two major political parties in Timor, a lot of money is being spent on a place with very few people. So Akusi International Airport, that has no international flights, is a far nicer airport than Dili Airport. It is a brand new airport. They've got a brand new port. They've got no potholes. They've got really nice roads, and it's like a ghost town. Every time I go there, or people I know go there, they go, "Where are all the people?" And I'm like, there is not many people, but a lot of political sway as an enclave has meant it's got very good infrastructure. Now, it's not somewhere with like, you must go and see this or that. But again, it's just quite a pleasant place to walk around. There's some interesting churches, shrines, there's some nice beaches. The landscape is drier and different, but it's a little bit like Dili, that you've got beaches, then you've got the flat with the city or the town, and then you've got these amazing hills that go up behind. So it's quite an impressive place to see, and very few people go to Akusi. So Akusi, if you want to get off the beaten track, I'd highly recommend. Oh, just a note for anybody. So generally you'll fly into Dili International Airport. You can get a tourist visa, a 30-day tourist visa. It costs $30.
Okay.
You have to have cash. There is no ATM accessible at that side of immigration. It's something that we talk to the Ministry of Tourism, trying to sort out, and there's no Wi-Fi there. And so you just have to know that you need $30 per person to get your 30-day tourism visa when you arrive into Dili Airport. And then to get a taxi from there, expect to pay between $15 and probably $25. They do have a bit of a rates. There's a board with how much it costs, but expect to pay about $15 to get a taxi into town, and that will take probably 20 minutes depending on traffic.
Good to know.
So,
I think you're getting close to the end here. Anything else we want to say before we get to our wrap-up questions?
one thing that's worth noting is that nobody comes to Timor-Leste for the internet. So they did a survey, or if you do, you're a bit masochistic. So they did a survey last year, one of these global surveys, and it said the internet speed in Timor-Leste is the fourth worst in the world, behind, I think, Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen. It works. It's not that overly reliable. There's basically no Wi-Fi. There's no public Wi-Fi. There's no free Wi-Fi. Everything is done off your phone. So when you arrive, either at the airport or in town, get yourself a SIM card. eSIMs might be possible, but there are probably not many options for Timor-Leste. So get yourself a SIM card. If you do the sort of pay-as-you-go, where you pay for the amount of data you need, the speed is... It's fine for you checking your Facebook. If you watch Netflix, you're going to use up all your data very quickly. You're not going to be able to upload stuff that easily. If you get one of these unlimited plans, they're amazing for the first 3 hours, and then you hit the data cap, and then they grind to a halt, and they barely work. And also, the internet is faster in the morning than it is in the evening. The reason is Timor-Leste does not have a fibre optic cable into the country. And given half the countries in the Pacific, which are way more remote, have fibre optic cables and much better internet, it is a bit of a mystery. They are finally now installing a cable from Australia, which will be installed next year, 2025, and should make a difference to the speed. But there's just not a lot of bandwidth going into the country, so that is something worth noting. So I think that's fairly comprehensive.
As we get to our wrap-up questions, you're standing in the prettiest spot in all of Timor-Leste. Where are you standing, and what are you looking at?
I love the hiking, so I'm probably up on a hill somewhere. Hopefully I'm walking down the hill, because walking up the hill is quite hard work in the heat, but the views... I can see a beautiful coast, I can see the city or the landscape and villages below. I'm up in the mountains. Life is good.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Timor-Leste.
Oh, there's so many things. Oh, because you're like, oh, Timor, things that are a bit frustrating, particularly because I'm living here versus being a traveller here.
Right.
I mean, the thing that kind of gets to me is the noise. I went up to Saloy Crap. It's a really nice lagoon surrounded by rice fields. It's an agricultural area. It's pretty remote. We took 2 days to hike there. And middle of the night, oof, 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 the music's not bad. And then the football started, because I was hiking it during the European Cup. and football, and they love football here. And so, and slightly weirdly, I find a lot of them support Portugal, which, as the former colonizer, is a bit weird. But the problem is the matches were on at like 3 a.m. So at 3 a.m. they would be having a party because the football was on. So that's the thing that I think about Timor, is it's quite noisy. So earplugs are recommended, but it's also lively. There is life, there's stuff happening. But if you're a light sleeper, it can be a bit challenging.
And if you had to summarize the country in just 3 words, what 3 words would you choose?
Fascinating, spectacular, undervisited.
Excellent.
Hyphenated.
I'll give you that. Our guest again has been Jonty Crane, and his website again is exploringtimor.com. And I'm seeing that you have links, Jonty, to your guidebooks from the website as well.
I do, yes. So they're available on Amazon as ebooks. And there's lots of information on the website as well. To be honest, most of the guidebook content is on the website. So you could have a look around there, because I'm just trying to promote the country. And there's lots of videos and various other things which hopefully will whet your appetite for this unusual destination.
And is there one blog post that we ought to highlight as a great place for people to start?
So the site is actually structured around what there is to do, how to plan your trip. So you can follow the kind of links through, and then that should give you an idea of what to do and see in the country.
Excellent. Jonty, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your obvious love for Timor-Leste.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for letting me talk about Timor for an hour.
Since you're new to H&R Block, we'll look at your returns from the last 3 years for any money your last guy might have missed, for free.
I could get money back from last year?
You could. We'll find any mistakes.
Could have really used that 2 years ago when I dated that mistake for 5 months.
Don't leave money on the table. Switch to H&R Block and get a free Second Look review. Second Look is included at no additional cost with the purchase of tax preparation. Results vary. All tax situations are different. Fees apply if you have us file an amended return.
Hi there, I'm Lale Arakoglu, host of Women Who Travel. At the start of this year, I spoke to my friends and colleagues at Condé Nast Traveller, Megan Spurrell and Artie Menon, who've masterminded a bumper list of where to travel in 2025. It was fascinating to hear the places they're excited about, like Kodiak Island in Alaska.
The thing that I'm really excited about is the native-owned Kodiak Brown Bear Center. And if you stay in one of their lovely cottages, there's the opportunity to share space with the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world. And this both terrifies me and makes me all warm and tingly inside. In 2025, there's going to be like Banya-style steam baths and saunas and whatnot.
So you can come face-to-face with a bear and then go to your steam bath to...
If I come face to face with a bear, I better get a steam bath after.
or share the steam bath with a bear. I mean, stranger things have happened.
Join me on Women Who Travel for more adventures wherever you get your podcasts.
Special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. This is my day job now, and I did thank you in my acceptance speech for the entry into the Podcast Hall of Fame, as I did thank all the listeners, because I thank you for listening to the show and for telling your friends about it as well. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a patron of the show, you can go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. If you're interested in learning more about the Podcast Hall of Fame induction, I'll put a link in the show notes for this episode for the ceremonies. If you just want to skip to Gary Arndt introducing me and my short acceptance speech go about 57 minutes in. When this episode hits your podcast player, I will actually be at the airport getting ready to get on a plane back from Dubai. An interesting story. United Airlines said they liked the podcast, and would I be interested if they sent me anywhere they fly internationally in business class? Dubai is what I chose, and you'll hear more about that next week, as well as what the experience was like. The 3 newest blog posts on amateurtraveler.com, One Day in Joshua Tree National Park, Perfect Itinerary, that's mine, The Hidden Gems and Undiscovered Places in Palawan, the Philippines, that is a guest post, and Peru Itinerary, Lima, Cusco, Sacred Valley, and Machu Picchu, another commission post by one of the writers of HotelScoop-.com, which is one of the other sites I own. And with that, we're going to bring this episode of Amateur Traveler to a close. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.